In this video, we're going to cover the basics of what loops are and how we can use them. So I'm back in my same script, the first script, and I'm just going to delete everything again, just so we're basically at a brand new script. In this video, we're going to cover the two most common types of loops. There are others that you'll learn as we progress through the course, but these are the two you're going to use the most. So to explain what a loop is, it's just like the name. It's a section of code that you're going to tell to loop over and over again until a certain condition is met, and then it's going to stop. So for the first one, I'm going to use it in start here. And this is what's called a for loop. To create one, we just type the word for, and then we put open close parentheses, and then our brackets after. So just like an if statement or a method, the format starts off the same. And everything in between these curly braces is what's going to run for the loop. Now inside these brackets, for a for loop, we need three things. So the first thing we need to put in here is what's going to be our counter. So we declare a variable just like we would normally using int, and then we give it a name. So in this case, what's really common to use for for loops is the letter I. Now when I create this variable, I need to assign it a value. The most common for for loops is to usually start at 0 for your counter, but you can do the opposite. You could start at 100 and then count down to 0, or you could start at 0 and count up, or you could even start in the middle. It's whatever works for your code, but majority of the time you're going to be using 0. So now, like any other statement, we need to add a semicolon to complete it, and then we need to add a second one in here. So the second part is the condition. And this is basically an if statement without the word if. So the way you can think of this is this first part here is going to be our counter. The second part is going to be what tells it to stop looping. So if we didn't put anything in here, this loop would basically go on forever and crash our game and crash Unity where you had to actually close it. So what we need to do in here is say why we want this loop to stop. So in this case, I'm going to put I is less than 10. And then semicolon again. So now our loop is always going to run as long as I is smaller than 10. So if we never make I become equal or greater than 10, this loop will run forever and crash our game and Unity. That's where this next third part comes in. This is where we tell the code what to do at the end. So I'm going to put I plus plus. And then we don't need a semicolon at the end of this third one. And you can see all the red lines went away. So now what I want to do is I'm going to first explain what this plus plus is, since you haven't seen that yet. So if we have a variable, say we have our variable here. In this case, I'm just going to name it j, since we already used I, and it's equal to 0. Now if I want to add a value to that, I can do j equals, and I can put the same variable in here. I could put j plus 1. So what this does is it says take j, and then remember equal is actually a sign into. So it's going to say take whatever's on the right and assign it into j. So it's going to say take the value of j, which is currently 0, add 1 to it, and then assign it back into j. So then it's going to be 1. And then if we were to do it again, it would be 2, and it would keep adding 1. But C# actually has a shortcut for this. If we don't want to type this over and over again, we can just add plus plus. And this is called an incremental operator. So what this does is it'll take whatever the value of j is and add 1 to it. And then we could also do minus minus, and that'll subtract 1. So it's just a shortcut so you don't have to type so much. And then that's what we do here. So what happens when you run a for loop is the first time it runs, it makes this variable, it assigns it this value, and then it moves over and it does the comparison. So it's going to check. So if we made this I 11 to start with, this loop would never run, because as soon as it looks here, it's going to say, oh, I'm not smaller than 10, break out and don't do the loop. And then after this part, right here where it checks the comparison, if this passes and it's supposed to loop, it'll run all the code that's in these brackets. Once it reaches the end, it comes back up here and it does this. So then at the end, it's going to increment our I to be 1. And then the next time it'll be 2, and so on. And it'll keep going until it reaches this condition here of less than 10. and then it's going to what's called break out of the loop. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to do a debug.log, and I'm just going to output the value of the variable I. So let's go run our game and take a look at this. Okay, now in the console, if you look, you see it starts from 0 and it counts up to 9, and then it stops. Now I'm going to show you the next type of loop, which is, this is called a while loop. And it's very similar to a for loop, but what we do is we type the word while, then we do our brackets again, and our curly braces, and again, everything in this code is part of this while. And now in here, we just put a condition. So this is, again, basically an if statement without the word if. So a good example we could do here is we could make a Boolean, and we could call it is alive. Let's set it to true. And then for the while statement, we could do while is alive equals true. So it's very similar to a for loop, except we don't set a number of times it runs. It's going to run forever until this condition is no longer true. And that brings us to another point I need to bring up right now is when you're working with loops, you need to make sure there is always going to be a condition in there that will make it break out of the loop. If we ran this code right now as is, this would actually cause Unity to completely crash. We would have to end task on it and reopen it and probably lose a bunch of work from whenever the last time we saved. There's no actual way to recover from a crash from a loop like this. That's called an infinite loop. Because what it does is Unity is going to basically halt everything and keep running this loop over and over again so other code doesn't get a chance to run. In a for loop, it's not as common because you put your condition and the I++ right in the loop. With a while loop, it's much easier because if you forget to add code that sets is alive to be false, this code is never going to break out of this loop. So just to make sure that doesn't happen, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the is alive equals false code right in here. So that way, if I forget anything right now, it's going to run this loop once, set it to false, and then the next time it tries to run, it's going to just break out of here and not do anything. So right now this loop is pretty useless. It's only going to run once, not do anything, set is alive to false, and then break out. But let's do a quick little example here. So let's set a health. I'm going to set it to be equal to 20. And just to note, this isn't the real way you would do a check if a player is alive in most games, but it's a good example of how this loop works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a debug message here. I'm going to output health and then the value of health. And now what I'm going to do is just like I showed, I can do health minus minus. So every time this code runs, it's going to subtract 1 from health. And then I can do an if statement here. I could do if health is smaller or equal to 0. That's where we're going to want to take this is alive equals false and put it in here. So now the only time it's going to set it is alive equal to false is if our health is smaller or equal to 0. So when we should die. And then right in here, we could put a debug message. We could say player has died. Okay, so let's go run this code. Okay, so we see our health. It starts at 20. It keeps going down, hits 1, and then the next time shows player has died, and now it's out of that loop and it's no longer looping. Okay, so those are the two most common loops. So now that you know how to do them, in the next video, I'm going to give you an assignment to do some practice with them. Okay, so here's an assignment I'm going to give you to get practice using loops. So this one, we're just going to use a for loop. And what I want you to do is make a variable called total, set its value to 0, and then I want you to make a for loop that's going to run 10 times. Now inside the loop, I want you to add the index variable that you created in the loop. So I demonstrated using the letter I. That's good practice. I would recommend to use that. But what you want to do is add that letter I to the total every time it loops. And then after the loop is complete, display that total to the console. So give that a try. If you have any trouble, I'm going to show you how to do it in the next video here. Okay, I hope you were able to get that going on your own. But if you weren't, or you had any trouble, or you just need this as reference, this is how I'm going to do it. So I'm just going to delete everything in my script again. Okay, and as per the instructions, the first thing I want to do is make a variable called total. So I'm making that up at the top here. So it's a variable that's available for the entire script. I'm going to set it to be equal to 0. And now in start, I'm going to make a for loop. I'm going to use the variable I, and I'm going to set it as 0. I'm going to make I, the condition should be I is less than 10. And then we want to increment I by 1 every time. In programming, you need to get used to everything usually starts at 0. So even though this runs 10 times, it starts at 0. So it's going to go from 0 to 9 instead of 1 to 10. That's very common in programming. If you specifically wanted this to start at 1, you could do that, and you would just have to tell it I should be less than or equal to 10, because otherwise it would only run 9 times. So this is perfectly legit as well. This would give you different output values on this assignment because it starts at 1 instead of 0. But if you did that, that is completely fine as well. That's the exact same concept. Okay, so we have our loop here. It's going to run 10 times. And then inside, what we want to do is add the variable I to the total every time. So what we can do is do total equals total plus I. Okay, so every time that's going to add, and then at the end, I want to output that total. So I can do debug.log, and I can put total, and then add the total. So if we go and run this and test it, okay, so we have a total of 45. Now if we wanted to actually show the output every loop, we could do a debug message inside the loop, and we could put something such as current index value is, and then we could add I, and then we could do and the total, or even and the current total is, and then let's add total. So now this is going to show every time the loop goes through what the value of I is and what the current total is. And then at the end, we could say final total. So this just, it's a little bit more clear. So let's just go run this. So now you see each time what the values are. So the first time I is 0 and the total is 0. Next time I is 1, total is 1. And then it keeps incrementing. And then we have our final total. Okay, so that's everything there. One other thing I just want to show too, when you're doing this, so total equals total plus I, remember I showed you the plus plus shortcut? We have a few other ones you can use here too. So if I wanted to do total plus a value every time, instead of doing total equals total plus I, there's a shortcut where you could do plus equals I. And now this is just going to say take whatever variable is here and add I to it. And then you could do the same thing with any other operators. So minus equals or multiplied equals. So those are just handy little shortcuts. But if you're not comfortable with those yet, doing it the long way like this is completely fine as well. Okay, so that's it for this lesson, and I will see you in the next video.